my husband abandoned me on my birthday to spend the entire day with his ex-wife. So I introduced his replacement at his mother's funeral. It was my 30th birthday, and my husband Jerome had promised we'd spend the whole day together since it was a milestone birthday, and I'd been talking about it for months. He'd made dinner reservations at the steakhouse I'd wanted to try, and said he'd taken the day off work, and we'd do whatever I wanted from morning until night. I woke up excited and made special breakfast while Jerome was in the shower. His phone rang and I saw it was his ex-wife Natalie calling, which was weird because their divorce was 5 years ago and they had no kids together. Jerome answered and I heard him saying he'd be right there and Natalie needed him. He came out saying Natalie's father had a heart attack and she had nobody else to call, and he needed to be there for her. I said her father had a heart attack twice a year whenever she needed attention, and Jerome knew this, but he said this time was real and serious. He said he'd be back in an hour just to drop her at the hospital and make sure she was okay. He said we'd still have our whole birthday celebration, just maybe starting a little later. I watched him leave at 8 in the morning in the clothes I'd bought him for our anniversary while I sat there in my birthday dress. An hour passed, then 2, then 4. Jerome texted saying Natalie was really upset and he couldn't leave her alone at the hospital. He said her father was stable, but she needed emotional support. I called him and heard Natalie laughing in the background about something on TV. I asked if they were watching TV at the hospital, and Jerome said they'd gone back to Natalie's apartment to get her insurance papers. At 2 in the afternoon, Jerome said Natalie's father was being discharged and needed a ride home. At 4, he said Natalie needed help setting up her father's medications. At 6, he said Natalie was too upset to cook, so they were grabbing dinner. At 8, when our reservation had long passed, he said Natalie had a panic attack and he couldn't leave. I spent my entire 30th birthday alone while my husband played caretaker to his ex-wife, who was probably faking everything like she always did. Jerome came home at midnight and found me sitting in the dark still wearing my dress. He said he was sorry, but emergencies happen and I should understand. He said Natalie had nobody else and he'd promised when they divorced to always be there as a friend. He said I was being selfish, making someone else's family crisis about my birthday. He actually bought Natalie flowers at the hospital gift shop to cheer her up while I got nothing. The next day, I found out from Jerome's friend that Natalie's father never went to the hospital. He'd had heartburn from eating too much pizza. Natalie had called Jerome crying anyway, knowing he'd drop everything. She'd done this before on our anniversary, on Valentine's Day, on Christmas morning. Always some emergency that only Jerome could solve. Jerome's mother Linda thought it was sweet that Jerome remained friends with Natalie. She'd always preferred Natalie to me anyway, and would mention how pretty and successful Natalie was compared to me. Linda would invite Natalie to family dinners and seat her next to Jerome while I sat at the end like an afterthought. Linda would show people photos of Jerome and Natalie's wedding, saying those were happier times. That's when I reconnected with my ex-boyfriend Nathan, who I'd dated before Jerome. Nathan was successful and handsome and had always treated me like a queen. We started having coffee just as friends catching up. Nathan remembered every detail about me that Jerome had forgotten. Nathan knew my coffee order and my favorite flowers and my middle name. Nathan listened when I talked instead of scrolling his phone. Nathan was also very photogenic and looked amazing in photos. 3 months later, Linda got diagnosed with terminal cancer and had maybe 6 weeks left. The family was devastated and Jerome spent every day at the hospital. Linda's last wish was to see all her children happy and settled. She kept asking Jerome if he regretted choosing me over Natalie. She'd hold Natalie's hand during visits and call her the daughter she'd wished for. The funeral was planned for a Saturday, and Jerome gave a speech about what an amazing mother Linda had been. I sat in the front row in a black dress looking appropriately sad. Halfway through the service, Nathan walked in wearing an expensive suit looking like a model. He sat next to me and took my hand. Jerome noticed immediately and stopped mid-speech. Nathan whispered something in my ear and I smiled slightly. Jerome continued stuttering through his speech while watching Nathan comfort me. The reception at Linda's house felt stuffy with too many people crowded into rooms that smelled like old furniture and the casserole dishes everyone brought. Jerome stood near the dining table trying to shake hands and accept hugs from relatives I barely knew. His eulogy notes were still wadded up in his left hand, while his right hand moved automatically through the motions of greeting people. I watched him glance at me every few seconds, then look at Nathan, then back at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Natalie hovered at Jerome's elbow, touching his arm and whispering things I couldn't hear. She kept trying to position herself between Jerome and his view of me, but he kept shifting to see around her. Nathan stood beside me with his hand resting lightly on my lower back, and several of Linda's friends kept looking at us. I heard one woman whisper to another about what a handsome couple we made. Jerome's face went white when he heard it too. Nina appeared at my side and gestured toward the kitchen. I followed her past the crowd and she closed the door behind us. The kitchen still had Linda's magnets on the refrigerator, and her handwriting on the grocery list stuck to the side. Nina crossed her arms and looked at me with eyes that reminded me of Jerome when he was trying to figure out if I was lying about something. She asked if Nathan was my boyfriend. Her voice came out quiet but sharp, like she already knew the answer and was testing if I'd be honest. I told her we'd been seeing each other for 3 months. Nina's eyebrows went up and she asked 3 months like she was doing math in her head. I said yes. The same 3 months Jerome spent running to Natalie every time she called with some fake emergency. Nina's face changed and she looked down at the floor. She said she'd watched Linda seat Natalie next to Jerome at every family dinner for years. She said she'd heard Linda compare me to Natalie constantly, and always make me sound like the worst choice. Nina's voice got softer, and she said she understood why I'd look for someone who appreciated me. She said it didn't make what I did at the funeral right, but she understood it. The kitchen door opened, and Jerome walked in. His face was red and his jaw was tight. He looked at Nina and told her to leave. Nina hesitated, then squeezed my arm and walked out. Jerome closed the door hard enough that it rattled the dishes in the cabinet. He asked who Nathan was. His voice came out low and angry, like he was trying not to yell with all the guests in the next room. I leaned against the counter and told him Nathan was someone who remembered my coffee order. Jerome's face twisted up, confused, and I said Nathan also knew my middle name and my favorite flowers. Jerome said that wasn't what he asked. He demanded to know how long this had been going on, and if I was cheating on him. I told him I'd been seeing Nathan since my birthday. Jerome's mouth opened, and he started to say something about Natalie needing help that day. I cut him off and reminded him that Natalie's father never went to the hospital. I said her big emergency was heartburn from eating too much pizza, just like I'd told him it would be. Jerome's face went from red to almost purple. He said Natalie was in crisis and needed support. I laughed, and it came out harsh. I told him Natalie had been in crisis every Christmas and every Valentine's Day, and every anniversary for 5 years. Jerome started to argue, but his voice got quieter, like he was realizing something. I pushed past him and walked back into the living room. Nathan was talking to some of Jerome's relatives near the fireplace. He had his suit jacket unbuttoned and looked completely comfortable, like he belonged there. An older woman I recognized as Linda's friend from church was asking Nathan what he did for work. Nathan explained he worked in finance, and the woman made impressed noises. She said we made such a handsome couple and looked at me with approval Linda never showed. Jerome came out of the kitchen and stopped when he heard her. Another relative asked Nathan how long we'd known each other. Nathan smiled and said we dated years ago before I met Jerome. He said we'd reconnected recently and picked up right where we left off. I felt Jerome's eyes on me from across the room. Nathan put his arm around my waist, and I leaned into him slightly. The gesture felt both real and like performance. I wanted Jerome to see what he'd been missing while he played hero to his ex-wife. Natalie appeared suddenly and asked Jerome if he was okay in this loud, concerned voice that carried across the room. She said he looked upset and offered to take him home if he needed to leave. Her hand went to his arm, and she tilted her head with this expression of worry that looked practiced. Jerome pulled his arm away. He told her he needed to talk to his wife. Natalie's face showed actual surprise, like she couldn't believe Jerome was brushing her off. She said she just wanted to help, and Jerome said she'd helped enough. His voice had an edge I'd never heard him use with her before. Natalie's eyes got wide, and she looked between Jerome and me like she was trying to understand what changed. I realized Jerome was finally seeing through her act because he was too scared about losing me to fall for her usual manipulation. Natalie stood there for a second with her mouth slightly open, then turned and walked toward the kitchen. Several people had stopped talking to watch the exchange. The reception started winding down around 4. People collected their empty casserole dishes and gave Jerome final condolences. Nathan and I stood near the door, and I could feel Jerome watching us from the porch. Stefano stood next to his brother, looking confused about everything that happened. Nathan opened the passenger door of his car for me, and I slid into the leather seat that still smelled new. He walked around to the driver's side, and before getting in, he leaned down and kissed my cheek. The gesture was soft and genuine, but also deliberate because he knew Jerome was watching. I didn't look back at the house as Nathan started the car. I could feel Jerome's eyes following us down the street past the other parked cars and the neighbors' houses. My hands were shaking slightly, and I gripped them together in my lap. Nathan drove me home and kissed me goodbye in the driveway. I went inside the house I shared with Jerome and started pulling clothes from the closet. I found my suitcases in the garage and began filling them with anything I'd need for a few weeks. Shoes and toiletries and the jewelry my grandmother left me. I was folding a sweater when I heard Jerome's car in the driveway. The front door opened, and his footsteps came down the hall. He appeared in the bedroom doorway, and his eyes were red from crying. He asked what I was doing. His voice cracked on the last word. I told him I was packing. Jerome came into the room and said we needed to talk about this. He said he knew he messed up with my birthday, but we could fix it. I kept folding clothes and putting them in the suitcase. Jerome said my name 3 times, getting louder each time. I finally looked at him and said this wasn't about one birthday. I told him it was about 5 years of coming second to Natalie. 5 years of his mother treating me like I wasn't good enough. 5 years of him calling me selfish whenever I asked for basic consideration. Jerome's face crumpled, and he said that wasn't fair. His voice got louder, and he said I was the one cheating. He said I was throwing away our marriage over one mistake. He insisted Natalie was just a friend who needed help, and I was making it into something it wasn't. I pulled out my phone and opened the calendar app. I'd been keeping track for 2 years of every time Jerome canceled our plans for Natalie. I showed him the screen with all the red highlighted dates. Christmas morning 2022 when he left before we opened presents because Natalie's pipes burst. Valentine's Day 2023 when he missed our dinner reservation because Natalie's car wouldn't start. Our anniversary last year when he spent the afternoon helping Natalie move furniture. My birthday this year. At least 15 other dates marked in red. Jerome stared at the phone and his face went pale. He said he didn't realize it was that many times. I asked how he didn't realize when I told him every single time that Natalie was using him. Jerome sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands. He looked up at me with tears running down his face. He said maybe he let Natalie manipulate him too much, but he swore he never had feelings for her. He said he never cheated, so what I did bringing Nathan to his mother's funeral was worse. I laughed and it came out bitter. I said emotional abandonment counted as betrayal, even if it wasn't physical. Jerome started crying harder and said his mother just died and I humiliated him at her funeral in front of everyone. I told him his mother spent 5 years humiliating me at every family gathering while he said nothing. I reminded him about Linda showing people his wedding photos with Natalie. About Linda seating Natalie next to him at dinners while I sat at the end. About Linda calling Natalie the daughter she wished for. Jerome said his mother was difficult, but she was still his mother. I said I understood that, but he chose to let her treat me terribly, and never once stood up for me. I zipped the suitcase closed and told Jerome I was staying with Sabina for a while. I said we needed space to figure out if this marriage could be saved. Jerome grabbed the suitcase handle and refused to let go. He said we could work through this if I just gave him a chance. He said he'd do anything to fix it. I pulled on the suitcase, but his grip was tight. I told him to let go and he shook his head. He said he loved me and couldn't lose me. I yanked harder on the suitcase and it came free from his hands. Jerome stood up and tried to block the doorway. I pushed past him and he grabbed my arm. I told him not to touch me and he let go immediately. He followed me down the hall still talking. He said he'd cut off contact with Natalie. He said he'd go to counseling. He said whatever I needed him to do, he'd do it. I opened the front door and put the suitcase in my car. Jerome stood on the porch in the same spot where he'd watched me leave with Nathan hours earlier. He was still pleading when I backed out of the driveway. I could see him in the rearview mirror standing there alone as I drove away. Sabina's apartment smelled like red wine and takeout Chinese food when I arrived with my suitcase. She opened the door in sweatpants and took one look at my face before pulling me inside. I dropped the suitcase in her hallway and sat on her couch while she poured 2 large glasses of wine. She sat across from me and waited for me to talk. I told her everything starting with the funeral, and Nathan sitting next to me and Jerome's face when he saw us together. I explained about the fight at home and the calendar I'd been keeping, and how Jerome finally looked at all those red dates and went pale. Sabina listened without interrupting, and when I finished she took a long drink of wine. She said Jerome absolutely deserved consequences for years of putting Natalie first. She said any husband who abandons his wife on her 30th birthday for his ex deserves whatever he gets. Then she leaned forward and said bringing Nathan to the funeral was brutal though. She said it was calculated and public and designed to hurt Jerome in front of his entire family right after his mother died. I didn't deny it because she was right. I told her it was supposed to hurt him as publicly as he'd hurt me privately all these years. Sabina nodded and asked if I actually had feelings for Nathan, or if he was just a weapon I was using against Jerome. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't know. Everything with Nathan had been tangled up in my anger at Jerome from the start. Nathan remembered my coffee order, but was that love, or just him being observant? Nathan listened when I talked, but was I drawn to him, or just to someone who wasn't Jerome? I sat there holding my wine glass and admitted I couldn't separate my feelings for Nathan from my need to prove Jerome wrong about me. Sabina said that was something I needed to figure out before I made any permanent decisions about my marriage. 2 days after the funeral, Nathan took me to dinner at an Italian place downtown. He wore a nice shirt and pulled out my chair and asked how I was holding up after everything with Jerome. I said I was staying at Sabina's and didn't know what came next. Nathan reached across the table and took my hand. He said he'd help me find my own apartment if I wanted. He said I deserved better than a husband who treated me like an afterthought. The waiter brought our food, and Nathan talked about his work, and asked about mine, and was sweet and attentive like always. But sitting across from him, I noticed something in his expression when he mentioned the funeral. He looked satisfied in a way that made me uncomfortable. He said he was glad he could be there to support me, and that Jerome's face when he saw us together was priceless. Nathan actually used the word priceless like he'd enjoyed being part of humiliating Jerome. I picked at my pasta and watched Nathan talk about how Jerome never appreciated me, and how he'd always known I deserved someone better. His words were kind, but his tone had this edge of competition like he'd won something. I started wondering if Nathan had his own reasons for wanting to prove he was better than my husband. Maybe our whole relationship was built more on competition and revenge than genuine connection. Maybe Nathan wanted to be with me partly because I was Jerome's wife, and taking me away from Jerome meant he'd won. I finished dinner feeling strange and confused about whether anything with Nathan was real, or if we were both using each other for the wrong reasons. Jerome called my phone 17 times over the next week. I blocked his number after the 5th call, but then he started texting from different numbers. The messages alternated between apologizing and accusing me of destroying our marriage over his friendship with Natalie. He'd text that he was sorry and wanted to fix things. Then an hour later, he'd text that I was throwing away 7 years over one bad birthday. He'd say Natalie was just a friend who needed help. Then he'd say I was the one who cheated by bringing Nathan to his mother's funeral. I stopped reading the texts after a while. His brother Stefano called on Thursday evening. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Stefano said Jerome was a mess and barely eating. He said Jerome loved me and made a mistake, but everyone makes mistakes. He asked if I was really throwing away 7 years over one bad birthday. I told Stefano to look at the calendar I sent Jerome. I told him to count how many times his brother chose Natalie over me. Christmas morning when Jerome left before we opened presents. Valentine's Day when he missed our dinner reservation. Our anniversary when he spent the afternoon helping Natalie move furniture. My birthday this year. At least 15 other dates marked in red. I asked Stefano if he'd accept that treatment from his wife. I asked if he'd be okay with his wife abandoning him repeatedly for her ex-husband. Stefano went quiet on the other end. He said he didn't realize it was that many times. I told him Jerome didn't realize it either because he never bothered to notice how often he chose Natalie until I showed him proof. Nina called the next day with a different perspective. She said she'd been thinking about the funeral and everything that happened. She admitted she'd watched Jerome prioritize Natalie for years, and always wondered why I put up with it. I asked why she never said anything if she noticed. Nina sighed and said their mother Linda actively encouraged Jerome to stay close to Natalie. She said Linda used to tell Jerome that Natalie was the one who got away. She said Linda told Jerome he owed Natalie friendship after the divorce, even though the divorce was Natalie's choice. Nina's voice got quieter and she said Linda used to compare me unfavorably to Natalie constantly, not just at family dinners but in private conversations with Jerome. Linda would tell Jerome that Natalie was prettier and more successful. Linda would suggest that Jerome made a mistake marrying me. Linda would say I wasn't good enough for the family. Nina said she felt guilty for never speaking up about how wrong that was. She said she should have defended me, but Linda was their mother, and it felt disloyal to contradict her. I sat on Sabina's couch listening to Nina confirm what I'd always suspected. Linda never wanted Jerome to marry me. Linda spent 5 years trying to convince Jerome to go back to Natalie, and Jerome let her do it because he couldn't stand up to his mother even when it meant letting her destroy his marriage. 2 weeks after the funeral, my phone rang with Jerome's number. I'd unblocked it the day before because blocking him felt childish. I answered and Jerome's voice was uncertain. He said Natalie called with another emergency. Her car broke down and she needed a ride to work. Jerome asked if it was okay if he helped her. I almost laughed at the question. I told him he was a grown man who could make his own choices. I said if he went running to Natalie again, then he was proving everything I said about his priorities. Jerome was quiet for a long moment. He said he'd tell Natalie to call someone else. I said okay, and hung up. An hour later, Jerome texted that he told Natalie to contact a tow truck company. He said Natalie got angry and said he was abandoning her. He said he told her he couldn't keep helping with every emergency because it was damaging his marriage. I stared at the text message. For the first time in our marriage, Jerome actually followed through and didn't go rescue Natalie. I didn't respond to the text, but I saved it in my phone. I met with a divorce attorney on Tuesday afternoon. The office was downtown in a tall building with gray carpets and framed diplomas on the walls. The attorney was a woman in her 50s who asked basic questions about my marriage. How long we'd been together, if we had kids, if we owned property. I answered everything while she took notes. She explained how asset division would work in our state. She said we'd have to split the house and our savings. She asked if I wanted to pursue divorce or legal separation first. I told her I didn't know yet. She said that was normal and gave me paperwork to look over. Walking out of that office made everything feel more real and final. I sat in my car in the parking garage and cried. Even though Jerome failed me repeatedly, ending a 7-year marriage still felt like losing something important. We'd bought that house together. We'd talked about having kids. We'd built a life even if that life was broken. Throwing it all away felt huge and scary, even though staying felt impossible. Nathan called that evening and asked how I was doing. I told him about the attorney meeting. Nathan said good and that I should file for divorce as soon as possible. He said Jerome didn't deserve another chance after years of disrespect. He said I should move in with him and we could start fresh together. His eagerness made me pull back. I told Nathan I needed space to figure out what I wanted without pressure from him or Jerome. Nathan's voice changed. He asked if I was seriously considering going back to Jerome after everything. He said Jerome would just go back to his old patterns. He said I was making a mistake if I gave Jerome another chance. I told Nathan I needed to make my own choices and that meant space from everyone. Nathan said fine in a tone that wasn't fine at all. His face when we hung up showed disappointment that made me question his motives even more. Did Nathan actually care about me, or did he just want to win against Jerome? Jerome showed up at Sabina's apartment on Saturday morning. Sabina answered the door and told him I didn't want to see him. Jerome asked her to please just give me something. Sabina came back inside holding flowers and a letter. The flowers were my favorite kind that Jerome always forgot. The letter was 3 pages handwritten on notebook paper. I sat on Sabina's couch and read it. Jerome apologized for every time he chose Natalie over me. He listed specific incidents. Christmas morning 2022 when he left for Natalie's burst pipes. Valentine's Day 2023 when he missed our dinner for Natalie's car trouble. Our anniversary when he helped Natalie move furniture. My birthday this year. He wrote that he'd been blind to the pattern because each incident seemed like an isolated emergency. He admitted he dismissed my feelings every time I said Natalie was manipulating him. He wrote that he let his mother disrespect me at family dinners and never stood up for me. He said he was sorry for calling me selfish when I asked for basic consideration on my milestone birthday. The last page said he wanted a chance to prove he could change. He offered to cut off all contact with Natalie. He offered to go to marriage counseling. He wrote that he loved me and didn't want to lose me. I folded the letter and put it in my purse. I told Sabina to tell Jerome I got it, but I wasn't making any promises. I said actions mattered more than words after years of broken commitments. Luciano called me on Monday afternoon. He worked with Jerome and said he needed to tell me something. Natalie showed up at Jerome's workplace that morning, demanding to know why Jerome was abandoning her. She said she needed support through this difficult time losing Linda, who'd been like a mother to her. She said Jerome was being cruel, refusing her calls. Luciano said Jerome actually told Natalie their friendship was inappropriate and damaging his marriage. Jerome said he needed to establish boundaries. Natalie cried and said Jerome was choosing me over their friendship. She actually said that like she didn't see the irony. Luciano said Natalie left crying, and Jerome looked shaken, but didn't back down. I thanked Luciano for telling me and sat with that information. Jerome was finally setting boundaries with Natalie. He was finally seeing her manipulation clearly enough to stop it. I agreed to meet Jerome for coffee on Wednesday. We met at a place near Sabina's apartment. Jerome looked tired with dark circles under his eyes. He ordered my coffee without asking because he'd finally remembered my order. We sat at a corner table and Jerome pulled out his phone. He showed me his blocked contacts list with Natalie's number. He showed me a text he sent telling her not to contact him anymore. He said he'd started individual therapy to understand why he let Natalie manipulate him. He said the therapist was helping him see how his mother's treatment of me was cruel, and how he enabled it by staying silent. Jerome seemed genuinely committed to change. But I told him that even if his intentions were good, I didn't know if I could trust him again after years of feeling secondary in my own marriage. Jerome's eyes filled with tears. He said he understood, and he'd do whatever it took to earn my trust back, even if that took years. I finished my coffee and told him I needed more time. Jerome nodded and said he'd wait as long as I needed. I met Nathan for lunch the next day at the restaurant where we'd had our first date years ago. He'd suggested the place, and I thought it was sweet until I sat across from him and noticed how pleased he looked with himself. Nathan ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, and started talking about apartments he'd found for me to look at. I told him I needed to slow down and think about what I actually wanted instead of just running from Jerome to him. Nathan's smile faded and he set down his fork. He asked what there was to think about when Jerome had spent 5 years treating me like garbage. I said Jerome was finally making real changes and blocking Natalie and going to therapy. Nathan's face went hard in a way I'd never seen before. He said I was making a huge mistake if I gave Jerome another chance because people like Jerome never actually changed. He said Jerome would be great for a few months, then fall right back into his old patterns the first time Natalie called crying. I told Nathan I appreciated his support, but I needed to figure out my marriage without pressure from anyone. Nathan laughed, but it wasn't a nice sound. He said he'd wasted 3 months being there for me and listening to me complain about Jerome just so I could run back to him anyway. I stared at Nathan and realized he'd never actually cared about what I wanted. He'd been waiting for me to leave Jerome and choose him instead, treating our whole reconnection like some kind of competition he was winning. I told Nathan we needed to stop seeing each other while I worked on my marriage. Nathan called me stupid for trusting Jerome again, and said I was using him for attention when I was lonely. He stood up and threw money on the table and walked out while other diners stared. I sat there feeling shaken because the man who'd seemed so understanding and supportive had turned mean the second I didn't do what he wanted. 3 months after Linda's funeral, Jerome and I walked into our first marriage counseling session together. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who told us to call her by her first name and said she didn't do easy sessions where everyone felt good. She asked us each to explain why we were there. Jerome talked about wanting to save our marriage and how he'd finally seen his mistakes with Natalie. I talked about 5 years of feeling invisible while Jerome prioritized his ex-wife over me. The therapist listened to both of us, then said we'd both made choices that damaged our marriage and we needed to own them. She looked at Jerome and said his pattern with Natalie was emotional abandonment, even if he never cheated physically. She asked him why he thought his ex-wife's needs were more important than his actual wife's needs. Jerome said he'd felt responsible for Natalie after the divorce because she didn't have family nearby. The therapist asked if he realized he'd been acting like Natalie's husband instead of mine. Jerome's face went red and he admitted he'd never thought about it that way. Then the therapist turned to me and said, bringing Nathan to Linda's funeral was calculated public humiliation designed for revenge, not resolution. She said I'd wanted to hurt Jerome as badly as he'd hurt me instead of actually trying to fix our problems. I tried to defend myself, but the therapist cut me off and said we were both here to be honest about our choices. She asked if we actually wanted to rebuild our marriage or if too much damage had been done. Jerome said he wanted to try. I said I didn't know yet, but I was willing to see if therapy could help. The therapist gave us homework about identifying our needs and boundaries. We left that first session both feeling raw and exposed, but also like someone had finally made us face the truth about what we'd done to each other. Nina called me 2 weeks into our counseling sessions. She said Natalie had contacted her asking Nina to tell Jerome that Natalie was having a crisis and needed him. Nina said she'd told Natalie that Jerome was working on his marriage, and Natalie needed to respect his boundaries and find other people to lean on. Natalie had cried and said Jerome was abandoning her when she needed him most. Nina had stayed firm and said Natalie's friendship with Jerome had been inappropriate for years, and it needed to end. Nina told me she felt proud of Jerome for finally standing up to Natalie's manipulation after watching it happen since his divorce. She also apologized for staying silent all those years while Linda favored Natalie over me at family dinners. Nina said she'd been conflict avoidant and hadn't wanted to upset their mother, but she should have defended me. She said Linda had actively encouraged Jerome to stay close to Natalie, and had told Jerome multiple times that Natalie was the one who got away. Nina admitted the whole family had enabled Jerome's behavior by treating Natalie like she was still part of the family, while making me feel like an outsider. I thanked Nina for finally saying something, and for blocking Natalie's attempts to contact Jerome. Nina said the family dynamics were shifting now that Linda was gone, and people were acknowledging how unhealthy some of her opinions had been. She said Jerome's brother was also starting to see how Jerome had neglected me for years. 6 months after Linda's funeral, Jerome and I moved back in together after living separately while doing intensive therapy. We weren't fixed and probably never would be completely fixed, but we were more honest now. Jerome hadn't had any contact with Natalie since that day at his workplace when he'd set boundaries. He actively worked to prioritize our marriage in ways he'd never done before, like actually keeping plans we made and asking about my day and remembering details about my life. I still carried anger about the years I'd felt invisible, and the therapist said that was normal, and we'd work through it over time instead of expecting it to disappear overnight. Our relationship felt different now because it was built on Jerome finally seeing me as his priority, and me learning to say what I needed before resentment built up to the breaking point. We started planning a small vow renewal ceremony for just the two of us. No family and no big event, just a private commitment that felt more real than our original wedding where Linda had seated Natalie in the front row and spent the reception talking about how beautiful Natalie looked. Jerome suggested we write our own vows this time and actually mean them. I agreed because I wanted promises based on who we actually were now instead of who we'd pretended to be 7 years ago.